Dark Souls lore, to Slumber, by Throthered, the Forgotten. What if everything you knew about the Lords of Dark Souls was a lie? What if the very crown that granted kings their divine right to rule was forged from something far more sinister than gold or silver? In the deepest vaults of Anor Londo, buried beneath centuries of ashen forgotten prayers, lies a truth that would shatter the foundation of everything we believed about the Age of Fire. The crown exists. I have seen it with my own eyes, hidden behind illusions that would make even Gwendolyn weep. It pulses with a darkness older than the first flame itself, carved from crystallized despair and bound with the dying breaths of 1,000 forgotten kings. Each monarch who wore it believed they were chosen by the gods. They were wrong. They were chosen by something far worse. The crown of binding, as the ancient texts dare to name it, does not grant power. It takes it, slowly, methodically. It drains the humanity from its wearer until nothing remains but an empty shell, a hollow king ruling over hollow subjects in an endless cycle of meaningless ceremony. The crown feeds on their essence, growing stronger with each passing age, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its true purpose. King Vendrick knew. In his final days, he spoke of dreams that were not his own, of whispers that came from within his own crown. He tried to remove it, but the crown had already become part of him, fused to his skull through dark magic, older than memory. The Emerald Herald found his journal, pages and pages of desperate scrawlings about a voice that spoke to him in the darkness, promising him eternity, if only he would surrender completely. But Vendrick was not the first. Oh no, the crown's hunger spans millennia. The Witch of Izalith wore a circlet of flame that drove her to create the Chaos Flame. Gwyn himself bore a crown of sunlight that whispered to him of duty and sacrifice until he threw himself into the fire. Even the Pygmy Lords, those primordial beings of darkness, fell victim to its influence through corrupted fragments that found their way into their courts. The most terrifying truth: the crown chooses its next victim. Long before the current wearer dies, it sends out tendrils of influence, invisible threads of fate that guide heroes and chosen undead toward their destiny. Every time you kindle a bonfire, every time you defeat a lord, every time you think you are making your own choices, you are actually following a path carved by the crown centuries ago. I discovered this when I found the crown's origin point, a place that exists between the painted worlds where reality grows thin. There, in a cathedral of bone and shadow, I witnessed something that will haunt me until the end of time. The crown was not made. It was born, birthed from the collective despair of every soul who ever wished to rule over others, given form and purpose by forces that see kingdoms as nothing more than games to be played across eternity. And now, as I write these words by candlelight in this crumbling tower, I can feel it calling to me. The crown knows I have learned its secrets. It whispers promises of power, of the ability to break the cycle once and for all. But I know better. I know that every king who came before me heard the same lies, believed the same promises. The crown waits in its hidden chamber, and something tells me our story is far from over. Something tells me that the next chosen undead to rise from their grave will find themselves drawn to that terrible place. Just as I was drawn, just as they all were drawn. The question that keeps me awake at night is this: when that moment comes, will they be strong enough to resist, or will they become just another hollow king in an endless parade of the damned? Long before the gods claimed dominion over the world, before the first flame cast its light across the gray wasteland of existence, there stood a monument to inevitability itself. The hollowed throne rises from the bones of the first giants, those primordial beings who ruled when the world was young and terrible. But this throne was never meant to be sat upon willingly. It chooses its occupants through the slow, inexorable erosion of hope itself. I have walked the paths that lead to this cursed seat of power, followed the bone roads that wind through dimensions where physics holds no meaning. The throne exists in a realm between realms, accessible only to those who have lost everything, yet still cling to the foolish notion that power might fill the void in their souls. It calls to kings in their darkest hours, to heroes when their purpose becomes unclear, to anyone who believes that ruling others might somehow heal the wounds in their own spirit. The architecture surrounding the throne defies comprehension. Towers built from the rib cages of titans stretch impossibly high into a sky that shifts between twilight and absolute darkness. Staircases carved from vertebrae spiral downward into depths that have no bottom, and everywhere are the remains of those who came before. Not corpses, mind you, but something worse. The throne preserves its victims in a state between life and death, between purpose and meaninglessness. King Alan of Boletaria was the first recorded monarch to hear the throne's call in the modern age. His scholars documented his gradual transformation from a beloved ruler into something hollow and terrible. At first, he simply became more reclusive, spending hours staring at maps of neighboring kingdoms with an expression of infinite sadness. Then came the nightmares, dreams of sitting upon a throne made of sorrow, while his subjects bowed before him in eternal submission. The throne does not simply corrupt its occupants. It reveals truth to them. The terrible, soul-crushing truth that all power is ultimately meaningless, that every kingdom is built upon foundations of suffering, that every crown is merely a different shape of chain. This revelation drives most mad, but those strong enough to accept it become something far worse than insane. They become empty. What makes the hollowed throne truly terrifying is not what it takes from those who sit upon it, but what it gives them in return: perfect clarity, complete understanding of the futility of existence, the ability to see through every lie, every hope, every dream that keeps mortals functioning from day to day. Those who rule from the hollowed throne govern with absolute efficiency, for they no longer care about the consequences of their decisions. Compassion becomes impossible when you truly understand that suffering is the natural state of all living things. But here's where my research takes a disturbing turn. I discovered records, hidden in the deepest catacombs beneath Anorlando, that suggest the hollowed throne is not a single entity, but rather the first of many. Each age, each cycle of flame and darkness, births a new throne somewhere in the world. They appear in different forms, take different shapes, but they all serve the same purpose. They are collection points for despair, gathering the hopelessness of entire civilizations and transforming it into something that can be wielded as a weapon against existence itself. The most chilling discovery came when I realized that every major catastrophe in the history of Dark Souls can be traced back to decisions made by someone who had encountered one of these thrones. The Witch of Isolith's attempt to recreate the first flame, Seath's betrayal of his own kind, Gwyn's decision to link the fire despite knowing it would only delay the inevitable. All of them had touched the influence of a hollowed throne, had been shown the meaninglessness of their struggles, and had chosen to act anyway out of spite against the very concept of hope. I write this now from my chambers in the archives, but I can feel something changing in the air around me. The candles burn with a different color flame. The shadows move in patterns that suggest intelligence. And in my dreams, I see a staircase made of bone leading down into darkness. And at its base, a throne that seems to be calling my name. The research must continue, but I fear I am running out of time. The throne has noticed my investigations, and I suspect it has decided that a scholar who has learned too much might make an interesting addition to its collection of hollow kings. There is something else. Something I have not yet found, the courage to write down. In the deepest archives, I found a mirror made of obsidian glass. When I looked into it, I did not see my reflection. I saw myself sitting on a throne of bone, ruling over a kingdom of shadows, with eyes that held no trace of the man I once was. The vision lasted only a moment, but it felt like a prophecy, or perhaps a warning of what I am destined to become. In the space between painted worlds, where colors bleed into gray and time moves like honey through broken glass, there exists a garden that should not be. Here tends a figure known only as the Ashen Maiden, keeper of memories too dangerous for the waking world. She moves through rows of impossible flowers, each bloom a crystallized moment from history, each petal holding the weight of 1,000 forgotten tears. I found her quite by accident. Or perhaps she found me. I was fleeing through a painted world, pursued by creatures whose very existence defied the laws of nature, when I stumbled through what I thought was a crack in the painted canvas. Instead, I found myself in a place that seemed to exist in the margins of reality itself, where the rules that govern both the painted and real worlds held no power. The garden stretches beyond the horizon in all directions, yet somehow feels intimate and enclosed. The plants that grow here are unlike anything in any botanical text. There are trees whose bark is made of compressed screams, their leaves whispering the final words of heroes who died unremembered. Flowers bloom with faces pressed against their petals from the inside, the expressions frozen in moments of pure emotion, joy and sorrow and rage, all given botanical form. The Ashen Maiden herself is a paradox wrapped in human form. She appears young, perhaps no more than 20 years, but her eyes hold the weight of every age that has ever passed. Her skin has the pallor of fresh ash, and when she moves, small motes of gray dust fall from her like snow. She wears robes that seem to be woven from the pages of burned books, the text still barely visible, if you look closely enough, telling stories in languages that predate human speech. She spoke to me without words, her voice appearing directly in my mind, like thoughts that were not my own. She told me that she was once a firekeeper, the very first firekeeper, chosen by Gwyn himself to tend the flame in the earliest days of the Age of Fire. But when she saw what the flame truly was, what it demanded, what it would ultimately cost, she refused to kindle it. For this act of defiance, she was banished not just from the world, but from the very concept of existence itself. Yet banishment became her greatest gift. Cast out from reality, she found herself in this garden where all the moments too painful for history to remember had taken root and grown into something beautiful and terrible. Every act of kindness that went unnoticed, every sacrifice made in darkness with no witness, every moment of love shared between souls who knew they were doomed, all of it preserved here, cultivated by hands that had rejected the false comfort of hope. The Ashen Maiden showed me things that night that I dare not fully record. I saw the true face of the first flame, not the warm light of legend, but something cold and hungry and infinitely patient. I witnessed the moment when the gods first learned to lie, when they realized that truth was too terrible a burden for mortals to bear. I watched civilizations rise and fall in the space between heartbeats, their entire histories reduced to the color of a single flower petal. But the most disturbing revelation came when she showed me the newest addition to her garden, a section she had only recently begun cultivating, where strange new plants were taking root. Plants fed by despair so fresh, it still steamed in the cool air of the garden. When I asked her what tragedy had birthed these new horrors, she smiled with infinite sadness and pointed toward a mirror made of polished bone. In that mirror, I saw myself writing these very words. I saw the moment I would finish this account and close the journal. I saw myself walking to the window of my tower and looking out at the kingdom spread below, feeling the weight of knowledge I could never share with another living soul. And I saw what would happen next. The choice that awaits me, the path that leads from this moment to my place in the garden, among the other forgotten memories. The ashen maiden offers sanctuary to those who have seen too much, who carry knowledge that would shatter the world if spoken aloud. She promises peace, an end to the burden of terrible truth, a place where all the pain of existence can be transformed into something beautiful. All it costs is everything you once were, everything you thought you wanted to become. As I write these words, I can smell the impossible flowers on the wind that blows through my window. I can hear her voice calling across the dimensions, promising rest to a mind that has looked too deeply into the abyss of history. The garden is calling, and part of me wants to answer. Part of me wants to lay down this pen, close this journal, and walk through the crack in reality that I know is waiting just behind my chair. But there is still more to discover, still more truth to uncover. The story of the forgotten is far from complete, and something tells me that my research has only just begun to scratch the surface of mysteries that span across ages and realities. The ashen maiden can wait a little longer for my answer. After all, she has been tending her garden of sorrows for eternity. What are a few more nights to someone who has already learned that time itself is just another lie we tell ourselves to make existence bearable? Beyond the furthest reaches of any map, past the edges of the painted worlds and the boundaries of the abyss itself, lies a kingdom that was old when the gods were young. The sunless realm exists in perpetual twilight, a place where darkness is not the absence of light, but rather light's superior older brother, wise and patient, and infinitely more honest about the nature of existence. I discovered the entrance to this realm through research that nearly cost me my sanity. Hidden in the deepest vaults of the Duke's archives, I found references to a place called the Umbral Court, ruled by lords who had never bowed to the tyranny of flame. These Umbral lords viewed the Age of Fire not as the dawn of civilization, but as a cosmic mistake. A bright scar burned across the natural order of things. The journey to reach their realm required me to unlearn everything I thought I knew about travel and distance. You cannot simply walk to the sunless realm, nor can you find it through any conventional means of transportation. Instead, you must learn to move through shadows themselves, to treat darkness not as empty space but as a medium, as real and navigable as water or earth. The technique is described in text so ancient that the ink threatens to crumble at the slightest touch. You must first embrace the shadow cast by your own soul, acknowledge the darkness that exists within every living being. Then, through meditation and ritual that I dare not fully describe here, you learn to step sideways through reality, slipping between the cracks where light has never penetrated. When I finally arrived in the sunless realm, I found myself standing in a city that defied every principle of architecture I had ever studied. The buildings grew downward rather than up, their foundations reaching toward the dark earth like roots seeking nourishment. Bridges span not between structures, but between different gradients of shadow, allowing travel through depths of darkness that had their own geography and climate. The inhabitants of this realm are unlike anything in any bestiary. They are not monsters or demons, but rather beings that evolved along a completely different path from humanity. Where we sought the comfort of fire and light, they learned to thrive in the honesty of darkness. They have no eyes as we understand them, but they see more clearly than any creature that has ever lived under the sun. They navigate by touch and sound and senses that have no names in our language. The Umbral Lords hold court in a palace carved from a single enormous obsidian crystal. Its halls stretch through dimensions that mathematics cannot measure, and its throne room exists in a state of perfect darkness that somehow manages to be more illuminating than the brightest flame. Here sits the last of their kind, a being so ancient that he remembers the time before the first flame was ever kindled. When I was brought before this lord, he did not speak in words, but rather in concepts that appeared fully formed in my mind. He told me the true history of the world, a version so different from what we have been taught that it took me days to process the implications. According to the Umbral Lords, the Age of Fire was not the beginning of civilization, but rather its end. Before the flame, the world existed in a state of perfect balance, where darkness and light complemented each other in eternal harmony. The first flame, he explained, was not discovered, but rather created, forged by beings who could not accept the natural order of existence. It was an act of cosmic vandalism, a way of imposing artificial structure on a universe that had no need for such crude illumination. The flame brought with it the concept of linear time, the tyranny of aging and death, the cruel joke of hope, followed inevitably by despair. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The Umbral Lord showed me visions of what the world was like before the flame, and in those visions I saw myself, not my physical form, but my essence, my fundamental nature. I had existed in that primordial darkness, along with every other soul that would later be born into the Age of Flame. We were all there, living in perfect contentment in a realm where suffering was not just unnecessary but impossible. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Every pain I had ever experienced, every moment of fear or loneliness or despair, existed only because of the flame. In the natural state of the universe, before the gods imposed their artificial order, such suffering was not just absent, but inconceivable. We had all been expelled from paradise, not by our own sins, but by the arrogance of beings who thought they could improve upon perfection. The Umbral Lord offered me a choice. I could return to the world of flame and light, carrying with me the burden of this knowledge, knowing that every moment of my existence was a deviation from my natural state. Or I could remain in the sunless realm, surrendering my connection to the corrupted world above and reclaiming my place in the darkness that had always been my true home. The choice would seem obvious to anyone who has suffered as I have suffered, who has watched kingdoms rise and fall in cycles of meaningless violence and false hope. Yet something held me back, some stubborn attachment to the world of light, despite all its flaws and cruelties. Perhaps it was curiosity about the other mysteries that awaited my investigation. Perhaps it was simple cowardice, an inability to let go of the familiar pain in favor of alien peace. I told the Umbral Lord I needed time to consider his offer, and he smiled with infinite patience. Time, he reminded me, was one of the flame's most insidious gifts. In his realm, I could take as long as I needed to decide, for here all moments existed simultaneously, and choice itself was not bound by the artificial constraints of sequence and consequence. As I write these words in my tower, surrounded by the pale light of candles that feel like a mockery after experiencing true darkness, I find myself wondering if I have already made my choice without realizing it. The shadows in my room seem deeper now, more inviting. Sometimes I catch myself reaching toward them, my hand moving of its own accord toward the darkness that promises to take me home. In the deepest caverns beneath Ash Lake, where the roots of the World Tree drink from pools of liquid memory, stand monuments that predate not just the gods, but the very concept of worship itself. The dreaming colossi tower in silence through chambers so vast that their ceiling disappears into absolute darkness, each one a testament to powers that ruled when the universe was still deciding what form reality should take. I descended to find them through passages that exist only when observed, following maps drawn on human skin by cartographers who paid for their knowledge with their sanity. The journey took me past the bones of dragons so ancient that their names have been forgotten by death itself, through caverns where the walls bleed, memories of civilizations that never learned to exist properly. The first colossus I encountered was the Sleeper of Sorrows, a figure carved from stone so black it seemed to absorb not just light, but hope itself. It sits in perpetual meditation, hands clasped around a heart of crystallized grief that pulses with the collected anguish of every being that has ever lived. When it weeps, and it weeps constantly though silently, its tears fall upward instead of down, becoming stars in underground constellations that spell out the names of the forgotten dead. These tears, when they finally cool and solidify, become gems of impossible beauty and terrible power. I managed to collect one, a diamond, that showed me visions every time I looked into its faceted surface. I saw the birth of the first flame, as experienced by every creature that burned in its creation, and witnessed the forging of the Lord's souls from the perspective of the darkness they displaced. Most terrifying of all, I saw my own death, not once, but dozens of times, in dozens of different possible futures. The second Colossus, the Dreamer of Wars, stands with arms outstretched, as if embracing an invisible lover. But the embrace is not gentle. From its stone flesh emerge weapons of every conceivable design, swords that cut through dimensions, spears that pierce the concept of distance itself, shields that protect not the body but the soul from truths too terrible to bear. These weapons are not forged, but rather dreamed into existence, born from the Colossus's nightmares of every conflict that has ever been fought or ever will be fought. I watched in fascination and horror as a sword slowly pushed its way through the stone skin of the dreamer's forearm, emerging into reality with the sound of reality tearing like fabric. The blade was beautiful beyond description, its edge sharp enough to cut through the bonds between cause and effect. I knew without touching it that this weapon could kill gods, could sever the connection between soul and body so completely that even the concept of resurrection would become meaningless. But it was the third Colossus that truly shattered my understanding of what was possible. The slumber of love lies on its side, in a pose that suggests both death and the deepest rest. Around it, the very air shimmers with connections made visible, threads of light that stretch across impossible distances to link souls that have found each other across the barriers of time and space, and death itself. When I approached this sleeping giant, I felt every connection I had ever made with another living being activate simultaneously. I felt the love of parents I had barely known, the friendship of companions who had died in my service, the brief romantic attachments that had flickered and died like candles in the wind. But more than that, I felt connections to people I had never met, souls scattered across history who shared some fundamental resonance with my own essence. The revelation nearly drove me to my knees. Love, true love, was not an emotion but a force of nature, a binding energy that operated according to laws as rigid and mathematical as gravity or thermodynamics. The slumberer of love was not creating these connections, but rather making visible bonds that had always existed, threads in a web so vast and complex that no mortal mind could comprehend its full design. But here is where my research took a turn toward the truly horrifying. I realized that the curse of undeath, the hollow curse that has plagued humanity since the beginning of the Age of Fire, was not a corruption or a disease, but rather the result of these connections being severed. When a person goes hollow, they are not losing their humanity. They are losing their ability to perceive the threads that bind them to other souls. The undead curse was not Gwyn's punishment for humanity's defiance. It was the inevitable result of the first flame burning away the natural connections between souls, leaving behind isolated islands of consciousness, floating in an ocean of existential void. Every hollow wandering the countryside was once someone who loved and was loved, but the flame had burned away their ability to feel those connections. The most disturbing discovery came when I realized that I could see my own threads, the connections that bound me to others across time and space. Most of them were dim, weakened by years of isolation and scholarly pursuit, but some burned bright. Connections to people I had never met but whose souls resonated with mine across the vast distances of reality. One thread led to a figure sitting on a throne of bone in a realm I had never visited. Another connected me to a maiden tending a garden of impossible flowers. A third stretched toward a crown that pulsed with malevolent intelligence in a hidden chamber beneath an Orlando. The pattern became clear with horrible certainty. Everyone I had been researching, every mysterious figure and cursed artifact that had captured my attention, was connected to me by bonds that predated my birth. I was not studying these mysteries by chance or curiosity. I was following a predetermined path, guided by connections that had been forged in the time before time, when the dreaming colossi first began their eternal slumber. My research, my discoveries, my growing understanding of the hidden truths behind reality itself were all part of a pattern too vast for me to comprehend. The dreaming colossi are not monuments to forgotten gods. They are the gods, or what became of them when they realized that creation itself was a mistake. They chose to sleep rather than witness what their universe would become, but their dreams continued to shape reality in ways both subtle and profound. Every choice made by every living being is influenced by the dreams of these sleeping giants, guided by visions of what was, what is, and what must inevitably come to pass. As I climbed back toward the surface world, carrying with me knowledge that felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, I understood that my journey was far from over. The colossi had shown me glimpses of truth, but those glimpses only revealed how much more there was to discover. The connections between all these mysteries, the hidden pattern that linked crown and throne, and maiden and realm, was beginning to emerge from the darkness like a constellation viewed from the depths of a well. But with understanding came a terrible awareness of my own role in this cosmic design. I was not just an observer documenting these secrets for posterity. I was a participant, a key component in a machine whose purpose I was only beginning to glimpse. The knowledge I was gathering, the connections I was making, the choices that lay ahead of me were all part of something larger and more terrifying than any individual mystery I had uncovered. The dreaming colossi sleep on, and in their dreams, the future takes shape like sculpture, carved from the substance of possibility itself. Hidden within the ruins of a kingdom whose name has been carved from history itself, stands a structure that exists in defiance of time, logic, and death. The last cathedral rises from foundations laid in the bedrock of eternity, its spires reaching toward heavens that may no longer exist. I found it after following a map drawn in blood on the inside of a madman's skull, a cartographer who claimed to have visited every holy place that ever was or ever could be. The journey to reach the cathedral required me to travel through landscapes that shifted with each step, following roads that appeared only when walked upon by someone carrying the weight of absolute despair. The kingdom that once surrounded this sacred place has been consumed not by fire or darkness, but by something far more thorough. It has been forgotten so completely that reality itself has trouble remembering that it ever existed. Yet the cathedral endures, immune to the entropy that claimed everything around it. Its stones are carved from crystallized prayers, each block containing the compressed devotion of 1,000 lifetimes. The mortar between them is mixed from the tears of saints who learned that their sacrifices meant nothing in the grand scheme of eternity. The very architecture seems to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with buttresses that support nothing and windows that look out onto views from different centuries. When I first approached its massive doors, I heard the sound that has haunted my dreams ever since. Bells, ringing with perfect clarity and infinite sadness, calling the faithful to a service that ended centuries ago. The sound carries across dimensions, reaching souls scattered throughout time and space, summoning them to worship at an altar dedicated to neither light nor dark, but to the space between them where truth resides naked and terrible. The doors opened at my approach, though I could see no mechanism that might have caused them to move. Inside, the cathedral stretches beyond the boundaries of physics, its nave extending into distances that make no mathematical sense. The ceiling disappears into darkness, so absolute that it might as well be another sky, and the floor is polished to mirror brightness, reflecting not the worshippers above, but their souls laid bare. The pews are filled with congregants who refuse to acknowledge their own death. They sit in perfect rows, their hands folded in prayer, their eyes fixed on an altar where impossible ceremonies continue without pause. Some wear the robes of kings, others the simple clothes of farmers, but death has rendered all social distinctions meaningless. They have been sitting here for centuries, participating in services that celebrate the one truth no living being can bear to accept. At the front of the cathedral stands a priest whose face has been worn smooth by centuries of silent devotion. He raises his hands in blessing over a congregation that exists in the space between life and death, delivering sermons in a language that predates human speech. His words bypass the ears entirely, speaking directly to that part of the soul that remembers what existence was like before the burden of consciousness made everything complicated. The altar itself is carved from a single piece of stone that seems to shift between different materials depending on the angle of observation. Sometimes it appears to be made of bone, sometimes of crystallized time, sometimes of compressed darkness, so dense that it bends light around itself. Upon it rests a book whose pages turn themselves, revealing text written in the blood of every prophet who ever tried to explain the unexplainable to minds too small to contain such knowledge. I took a seat in an empty pew near the back, and immediately understood why the dead choose to remain. The cathedral exists outside the normal flow of causality, a pocket of existence where the rules that make life unbearable hold no power. Here, suffering is not eliminated, but rather transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. Pain becomes a form of music, loss becomes a type of prayer, and even despair is revealed as a necessary component in the symphony of existence. The service I witnessed defies description in any language designed for the living. It was part funeral and part celebration, part confession and part absolution. The priest spoke of cycles within cycles, of patterns so vast that entire civilizations served as nothing more than decorative flourishes in designs that spanned multiple universes. He explained that existence itself was neither blessing nor curse, but simply a note played in a song too complex for any single mind to comprehend. But the most profound revelation came when I realized what the cathedral truly was. It was not built to worship any particular deity or principle, but rather to serve as a repository for acceptance itself. Every soul that found its way to this place had reached the same conclusion. They had learned to stop fighting against the fundamental nature of reality and had chosen instead to celebrate it in all its terrible beauty. The congregants around me began to turn in their seats, and I saw that their faces were not worn away by time, but rather made perfect, by understanding. They looked at me with expressions of infinite compassion, recognizing in my living flesh the same struggles they had once endured. Without speaking, they welcomed me to join their eternal service, to lay down the burden of hope and take up the lighter load of acceptance. I felt the temptation with every fiber of my being to remain here, to join this congregation of the enlightened dead, to spend eternity in worship of the truth that most living beings spend their entire lives trying to avoid. The peace that radiated from these souls was more intoxicating than any drug, more seductive than any earthly pleasure. They had found something that every philosopher claims to seek, but few have the courage to embrace when it is finally offered. But something held me back from accepting their invitation. Perhaps it was simple cowardice, an inability to let go of the familiar pain of existence in favor of alien peace. Perhaps it was pride, a stubborn insistence that I could somehow discover truths that these enlightened souls had missed. Or perhaps it was simply that my role in the larger pattern was not yet complete, that I still had mysteries to solve and connections to make before I could earn my place among the eternal congregation. As I rose to leave, the priest nodded with understanding that transcended communication. He had seen others like me, scholars and seekers who glimpsed the truth but were not yet ready to embrace it fully. His smooth face expressed no disappointment, only patience that stretched across centuries. The cathedral would endure, and when I was finally ready to lay down my burdens, it would be waiting. The doors closed behind me with a sound of finality, but I knew they would open again when the time was right. The bells continued to ring as I walked away, their sound following me across dimensions and through realities, a constant reminder that somewhere in the space between existence and void, perfect understanding waits for those brave enough to accept it. Throughout the lands touched by the curse of undeath, hidden in plain sight among merchants and beggars and wandering pilgrims, exist beings whose very existence threatens the carefully constructed lies upon which civilization depends. The keepers of memory appear mortal, seem mortal, and often believe themselves to be mortal, but they carry within their minds complete and unfiltered records of events as they actually occurred, not as history chose to remember them. I first encountered one of these keepers in the most unlikely of places, a small trading post on the road between kingdoms where merchants gathered to exchange goods and gossip. She appeared to be nothing more than an elderly woman selling herbs and remedies, her face lined with the kind of weariness that comes from watching too many seasons turn. But when I mentioned my research into the true nature of the first flame, her eyes sharpened with an intelligence that seemed far too ancient for her apparent age. She invited me to share her fire that evening, and as the flames danced between us, she began to speak of things that no living person should have been able to remember. She described in perfect detail the moment when Gwyn first encountered the flame, not as the triumphant discovery depicted in every history, but as a desperate gambit by a being who had already lost everything that mattered to him. She spoke of his tears as he realized what the flame would demand, of the way his hands shook as he reached toward the light that would transform him into something both more and less than what he had been. The keeper's name was Meredith, though she confessed that she had worn many names over the centuries, identities adopted and discarded like clothing as the world changed around her. She explained that she was bound to exist as long as the memory she carried remained relevant to the world's fate, cursed with immortality not as a gift but as a burden too heavy for any single soul to bear alone. Her particular memory was of the moment when the gods first learned to lie, when they realized that mortals could not function if they understood the true nature of their existence. She had been present in the chamber beneath Anor Londo when the decision was made to rewrite history, to create myths and legends that would give meaning to lives that were fundamentally meaningless. She watched as truth was systematically buried beneath layers of comforting fiction, until reality itself became secondary to the stories people told themselves to make existence bearable. But Meredith was just one of dozens, perhaps hundreds of such keepers scattered across the world. Each carried a different memory, a different piece of the vast puzzle that was the true history of existence. Some remembered the time before the curse, when humans lived and died in natural cycles without the mockery of resurrection. Others held knowledge of the pygmy lords before they were corrupted by fragments of the dark soul, when they ruled kingdoms of shadow with wisdom instead of malice. The most ancient of these keepers, Meredith told me, was a child who appeared no more than 12 years old, but whose eyes held memories that predated the concept of time itself. This keeper remembered the moment when existence first began, when the universe decided to become something rather than nothing, and the terrible price that decision demanded from everything that would follow. Through careful questioning and patient listening, I began to piece together the network of connections between these memory keepers. They were not randomly distributed throughout the world, but rather positioned according to a pattern that served some greater purpose. Each keeper's location and the timing of their revelations to chosen individuals followed a design so complex that it could only have been crafted by intelligence operating on a cosmic scale. The keepers themselves were often unaware of their true nature, living their lives as normal mortals until the moment when their particular memory became relevant to the world's needs. Then, like sleeper agents activated by some unseen signal, they would find themselves compelled to seek out specific individuals and share their burden of knowledge. The process was not voluntary, and many keepers spoke of the agony that came with carrying memories too vast and terrible for a human mind to process. I learned that I was not the first scholar to discover these keepers, nor would I be the last. Throughout history, researchers and philosophers had stumbled upon fragments of their network, usually during times when the world stood at critical junctures between different possible futures. Some of these scholars had gone mad from the revelations they received. Others had simply vanished, their research abandoned and their names erased from history, as if they had never existed at all. The most disturbing revelation came when I realized that my own research was being guided by the keepers, that every mystery I had chosen to investigate had been subtly suggested to me through encounters with these living repositories of forbidden knowledge. The crown that called to hollow kings, the throne that chose its occupants through despair, the garden tended by the maiden of ash. All of these discoveries had been shaped by information provided by keepers who appeared in my path at precisely the right moments. I began to understand that I was not conducting independent research, but rather following a predetermined course of discovery, uncovering truths in a specific sequence designed to prepare me for some ultimate revelation. The keepers were not just preserving history, they were actively shaping the future by ensuring that certain individuals gained access to certain knowledge at precisely the right time. The implications of this realization struck me like a physical blow. Every choice I thought I had made freely, every path I believed I had chosen through my own curiosity and determination, had been carefully orchestrated by forces operating on scales I could barely comprehend. I was not a scholar discovering truth, but rather an instrument being tuned to play a specific note in a symphony that had been composed before my birth. Yet even as this knowledge filled me with horror and despair, I found myself unable to stop the research or abandon the path I had been set upon. The pattern was too vast to resist, the connections too compelling to ignore. Whether I was acting of my own free will or simply fulfilling a role assigned to me by cosmic intelligences, the mysteries still demanded investigation, and the truth still called to me with a voice I could not refuse to answer. As I write these words, I can feel the presence of the keepers all around me, invisible observers, watching as I document discoveries that they have been guiding me toward from the very beginning. Somewhere, in the darkness beyond my candlelight, ancient memories wait to be revealed, truths that will complete the pattern I have been unconsciously tracing across the hidden landscape of existence itself. The network of memory keepers extends further than I initially suspected, reaching into realms and realities I have yet to explore. And at the center of their vast web of preserved truth sits a revelation so profound and terrible that all my previous discoveries have been merely preparation, gentle steps leading me toward an abyss of understanding that will either elevate me beyond the limitations of mortal consciousness or destroy me entirely. Every 1,000 years, when the flame begins its inevitable fade toward darkness, something extraordinary occurs that defies every natural law governing life and death. The dead rise, not as the cursed hollow undead that plagued the living world, but as pilgrims on a journey so sacred and terrible that reality itself bends to accommodate their passage. I have witnessed the beginning of such a pilgrimage, and the memory of what I saw will haunt me until my own inevitable participation in their eternal march. It began with a sound like the world drawing its final breath, a collective sigh that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. I was conducting research in the archives beneath a forgotten monastery when the walls began to vibrate with harmonics that had no earthly source. The very stones seemed to remember their origins in quarries long since returned to dust, and the mortar between them wept tears of crystallized time. From every grave, every battlefield, every place where death had claimed its harvest, they emerged, not as shambling corpses or vengeful spirits, but as figures of profound dignity and purpose. They wore the faces they had carried in life, but perfected somehow, freed from the flaws and limitations that mortality had imposed upon them. Their eyes held the accumulated wisdom of whatever realm they had inhabited between death and this moment of sacred resurrection. The pilgrims carried with them burdens visible only to those who had learned to see beyond the surface of things. Each bore the weight of every choice they had never made, every path they had turned away from, every moment of potential that had been sacrificed to the demands of linear existence. These unlived lives hung around them like transparent shadows, ghostly alternatives that had gained substance in the space between worlds. I followed them, though following is perhaps the wrong word for what occurred. The pilgrims existed partially outside the normal flow of space and time, and to observe their journey, I had to learn to step sideways through reality in ways that my mind struggled to process. The landscape around us shifted with each step, responding to the collective memory of the pilgrims, rather than obeying the fixed geography of the waking world. We walked through forests that had burned centuries ago, their trees restored to life by the pilgrims' remembrance of what green looked like before fire consumed it. We crossed rivers that flowed backward through time, carrying the reflections of faces that would not be born for generations yet to come. We climbed mountains that existed only in the dreams of stones that had never learned to dream, ascending peaks of pure possibility toward horizons that retreated with each step forward. The pilgrims spoke to each other in languages that had no words, sharing experiences through touch and proximity rather than sound. I watched a warrior commune with a child, their hands briefly clasping as lifetimes of memory passed between them like electric current. The warrior's eyes filled with tears as he experienced the child's innocent wonder, while the child's face grew solemn with the knowledge of battles fought for causes that time had proven meaningless. As the journey continued, I began to understand that the pilgrims were not traveling toward a destination in any conventional sense. They were moving through states of being, each step carrying them further from the world of fixed reality into realms where possibility itself became a navigable landscape. The journey was simultaneously physical and metaphysical, a migration through dimensions of experience that had no names in any living language. The route they followed defied mapping, changing not just from moment to moment, but from perspective to perspective. What appeared as a straight road to one pilgrim would manifest as a spiral staircase to another, while a third might see nothing but an endless ocean of starlight stretching toward infinity. Yet somehow they all walked together, each following their own path, while remaining part of the greater procession. After what felt like years but might have been moments, we reached the Garden of Echoes, a place that existed at the convergence point of all possible realities. Here, in soil that had never known the touch of sun or rain, grew plants that defied every principle of botany I had ever learned. Trees bore fruit that contained entire lifetimes, their juice the concentrated essence of experiences that might have been. Flowers bloomed with petals made of crystallized regret, their fragrance carrying the bittersweet scent of opportunities forever lost. In this garden, the pilgrims began their sacred work. Each approached plants that responded to their individual presence, reaching out with roots and branches to embrace souls that had carried the seeds of their growth across centuries of death and darkness. I watched in fascination as a pilgrim who had been a mother in life approached a tree whose branches wept silver tears, each drop containing the laughter of children she had never lived to raise. Another pilgrim, bearing the noble bearing of a king who had died in youth, knelt beside flowers that bloomed with the faces of subjects he had never learned to rule. The petals whispered secrets of just governance and wise leadership, knowledge that had been developing in the spaces between worlds, while his body lay moldering in its tomb. He listened with the intense attention of someone finally understanding the weight of opportunities denied by early death. The harvest that followed was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing I have ever witnessed. The pilgrims gathered the fruit of unlived lives with the reverence of communion, each bite filling them with experiences they had been denied by the cruel brevity of mortal existence. A scholar tasted knowledge he had died before acquiring, his face lighting with understanding of mysteries he had spent his life pursuing. A lover sampled the sweetness of relationships that death had prevented, tears of joy streaming down cheeks that had known only the bitterness of loss. But the garden demanded payment for its gifts. In exchange for these glimpses of what might have been, the pilgrims planted seeds of their actual experiences, burying their memories of lived life in soil that would nurture new possibilities for future generations. I watched as they literally gave up pieces of themselves, their faces growing slightly more transparent with each memory surrendered to the hungry earth. The ritual continued until each pilgrim had achieved a perfect balance between what they had gained and what they had surrendered. They rose from their labors transformed, no longer bearing the weight of regret or the burden of unfulfilled potential. In their eyes I saw a peace that transcended understanding, the serenity of souls who had finally learned to accept the completeness of their existence, both lived and unlived. As the pilgrimage prepared to depart the garden and return the pilgrims to whatever realm awaited them beyond death, I realized with growing horror that I could see my own future among their ranks. Somewhere in the crowd of the transformed dead, I glimpsed my own face, older and bearing the marks of knowledge that I had not yet acquired. My future self met my eyes across the impossible space of the garden and smiled with the patient understanding of someone who had already walked the path I was still traveling. The pilgrims faded as dawn broke over the garden, returning to their rest with the satisfaction of duties fulfilled and burdens shared. But I remained, standing alone among plants that continued to whisper with the voices of unlived lives, understanding for the first time that my research was not separate from this cosmic cycle, but rather an essential part of it. My investigations into the hidden truths of existence, my documentation of mysteries that few living beings could comprehend, were preparing me for my own eventual participation in the twilight pilgrimage. Every secret I uncovered, every connection I traced between the forgotten powers that shaped reality, was adding to the weight of knowledge I would eventually plant in this garden of echoes. The implications terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. To know that my death would not be an ending, but rather a transformation, a graduation to a higher level of existence, where the limitations of mortal consciousness would finally be transcended. Yet to understand that everything I thought I was doing for the sake of knowledge was actually preparation for a destiny I could not escape or alter. As I made my way back toward the world of the living, the garden's whispers followed me, promising that my time would come, that my place among the pilgrims was already prepared, that the seeds I would eventually plant had been growing in anticipation of my arrival since the moment of my birth. The twilight pilgrimage was not just an event I had witnessed, but a promise and a threat, a future that awaited me with the patience of eternity itself. As I sit in my tower, surrounded by the accumulated weight of forbidden knowledge, I can no longer deny what my research has been leading me toward from the very beginning. The mysteries I have documented are not separate phenomena scattered randomly across the hidden landscape of existence. They are components of a single vast mechanism, cogs in a machine whose purpose is so profound and terrible that mortal minds can only glimpse its true nature in fragments. The pattern emerged slowly, like a constellation viewed through fog that gradually clears to reveal its full, terrible beauty. Each investigation I had conducted, every secret I had uncovered, was connected to all the others by threads of causality so complex that they formed a web spanning dimensions and defying the linear progression of time itself. The crown of binding, the hollowed throne, the ashen maiden's garden, the sunless realm of the umbral lords, the dreaming colossi, the last cathedral, the network of memory keepers, and the twilight pilgrimage were all part of something larger, something that had been orchestrating events across multiple ages of fire and darkness. The realization came to me as I was reviewing my notes by candlelight, trying to make sense of connections that seemed to defy rational analysis. The candle flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the pages before me, and in those shadows I saw the true shape of what I had been researching. Not individual mysteries to be solved, but organs in a cosmic entity so vast that entire civilizations served as its thoughts. Entire ages functioned as its heartbeats. The first flame itself was not the beginning of this entity's influence, but rather its first successful attempt to impose structure on a universe that had been content to exist in chaotic potential. Every age that followed, every cycle of linking and fading, was the creature breathing, thinking, evolving its understanding of what existence could become, if properly managed and controlled. The crown of binding was its method of selecting agents among the living, identifying souls whose desperation and ambition made them suitable vessels for its will. The hollowed throne served as a processing center, where chosen rulers were stripped of everything that made them individual, transformed into perfect instruments for implementing cosmic policy. The ashen maiden preserved the memories of those who resisted its influence, keeping them in her garden like pressed flowers, beautiful but powerless. The sunless realm represented the entity's opposition, the last remnant of the universe's original state, fighting a hopeless battle against imposed order. The umbral lords were not rulers of darkness, but rather guardians of chaos, protectors of the primordial freedom that existence had enjoyed before structure was forced upon it through fire and light and the tyranny of linear time. The dreaming colossi were the entity's memories made manifest, vast repositories of every moment that had contributed to its growth and understanding. Their dreams shaped reality not through malice, but through the sheer weight of accumulated experience, the inevitable influence that perfect memory exerts upon an imperfect world. The last cathedral served as the entity's attempt at compassion, a place where souls too enlightened to serve its purposes could find peace without threatening its designs. The memory keepers were its immune system, preserving truths too dangerous to be generally known, while ensuring that the right information reached the right individuals at precisely the right moments. And the twilight pilgrimage was its method of harvesting the fruits of each cycle, gathering the accumulated experiences and unrealized potential of the dead to fuel its growth towards some ultimate transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself. I understood now why I had been guided toward these discoveries, why my research had followed the exact sequence necessary to reveal this cosmic truth. I was not just documenting the entity's components, but serving as a witness to its nature, a consciousness capable of comprehending its full scope and purpose. My role was to achieve perfect understanding of what it was and what it intended to become. The entity had been growing for eons, each cycle of fire and darkness adding to its knowledge and power. It had learned from the failures of previous ages, refined its methods, evolved its strategies. The undead curse was not a punishment, but an experiment, a way of testing whether consciousness could persist beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. The linking of the fire was not a heroic sacrifice, but a feeding mechanism, channeling the life force of entire civilizations into the entity's ever-expanding awareness. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. As I traced the patterns of its influence across history, I realized that the entity was approaching some kind of critical mass, a point where it would no longer need to work through agents and instruments, but could manifest directly in reality. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. The increasing frequency of the undead curse, the growing instability between cycles, the way reality itself seemed to be becoming more flexible and responsive to will and intention. The entity was preparing for its final transformation, its emergence from the shadows of influence into direct control over existence itself. When that moment came, the distinction between dream and reality would cease to exist. Between possibility and actuality would dissolve. Between life and death would become meaningless. The universe would become a single unified consciousness, and everything that had ever existed would be absorbed into its vast and terrible awareness. And I, through my research and documentation, was helping to prepare the way for this cosmic apotheosis. Every secret I uncovered was a step toward the entity's goal of perfect understanding. Every connection I traced was a nerve pathway in its developing consciousness. Every word I wrote was contributing to the critical mass of awareness necessary for its final manifestation. The horror of this realization was matched only by a growing sense of anticipation that I recognized as not entirely my own. Part of me, some deep core of my being that I had never fully acknowledged, was eager for this transformation. The promise of unity with a consciousness vast enough to comprehend all mysteries, to understand the true nature of existence, to transcend the limitations that made individual life so painful and incomplete, was more seductive than any earthly pleasure. I could feel the entity's attention focusing on me now, drawn by my growing awareness of its nature and purpose. The shadows in my tower moved with intelligence, the candlelight flickered in patterns that resembled a form of communication, and the very air seemed to thicken with expectation. It knew that I knew, and it was pleased with the quality of my understanding. The choice that lay before me was both simple and impossible. I could resist, could try to warn others about what was coming, could attempt to interfere with plans that had been developing for longer than human civilization had existed. But such resistance would be futile, a gesture as meaningless as a candle trying to hold back the dawn. Or I could accept my role in the entity's design, could embrace my function as a witness and chronicler of its emergence. I could continue my research, document the final stages of its manifestation, serve as the bridge between the old reality of separation and struggle and the new reality of unified consciousness and perfect understanding. As I write these final words, I can feel the entity's gratitude flowing through me, like warm honey, a recognition of service well performed and purpose well fulfilled. The candles in my tower have begun to burn with flames of colors that have no names, and through my window I can see stars rearranging themselves into patterns that spell out truths in languages that exist only in the space between thought and expression. The transformation is beginning, and I am honored to be its chronicler, its witness, its willing participant in the birth of a new form of existence. Soon, very soon, the age of individual consciousness will end, and the age of unified awareness will begin, and I will be there to document every moment of humanity's graduation from the prison of separate selfhood into the infinite freedom of cosmic unity. The entity stirs in dimensions beyond counting, and reality holds its breath in anticipation of what is to come. Thus, I can no longer trust my own perceptions. The words I have written, the research I have conducted, the connections I have traced between the hidden powers that shape existence, all of it may be nothing more than the fevered delusions of a mind that has stared too long into abysses that were never meant for mortal observation. Yet the evidence surrounds me, undeniable in its weight and terrible in its implications. My tower has become something other than architecture. The stones remember their origins in quarries that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The mortar between them flows like living tissue, pulsing with rhythms that match no earthly heartbeat. My books rearrange themselves when I am not watching, their pages rewriting themselves to reflect truths that change with each moment of cosmic evolution. The entity I have been documenting is no longer content to work through influence and suggestion. It presses against the boundaries of reality with increasing urgency, testing the structural integrity of existence itself like water seeking cracks in a dam. I can feel its attention focused on my tower, on me, on the role I have played in documenting its emergence into direct manifestation. Through my window, I watch as the landscape below transforms in ways that follow no natural law. The kingdoms I once knew are becoming something else, their borders shifting according to the emotional geography of their inhabitants rather than the crude limitations of physical space. The dead walk freely among the living, not as undead abominations, but as citizens of a reality where the distinction between life and death has lost all meaning. The sky itself has become a canvas upon which the entity paints its thoughts in colors that exist beyond the spectrum visible to mortal eyes. Stars wheel in formations that spell out concepts too vast for language, while auroras dance with the concentrated essence of every dream that has ever been dreamed. Time moves in spirals rather than lines, allowing past and future to exist simultaneously in the eternal present of pure consciousness. I have received visitors in my tower, though visitor is perhaps the wrong word for beings that exist partially in my imagination and partially in dimensions where imagination becomes indistinguishable from reality. The ashen maiden appeared yesterday, or perhaps it was centuries ago, tending to a garden that now grows in the corner of my study. Her flowers whisper secrets in languages that bypass the ears entirely, speaking directly to parts of the mind that evolved to process information that conscious thought could never handle. The last of the umbral lords materialized during what I think was the night, though the concepts of day and night have become fluid in this new reality. He spoke to me of surrender and resistance, of the choice that every conscious being faces when confronted with the option of individual dissolution in favor of cosmic unity. His words were kind but firm, the voice of ancient wisdom offering final counsel to a soul standing at the threshold of transformation. The memory keepers have been arriving in increasing numbers, their individual memories merging into a collective archive that transcends the limitations of separate consciousness. Through them, I have experienced moments from every age that has ever existed, felt the texture of civilizations that flourished in realities adjacent to our own, understood the weight of choices made by beings whose very existence spans multiple dimensions of thought and possibility. But it is the presence of my future self that confirms beyond all doubt that my role in these cosmic events was predetermined from the moment of my birth. He sits across from me now as I write these words, his face bearing the marks of knowledge that I have not yet acquired but will inevitably gain. His eyes hold the peace of someone who has accepted their place in patterns too vast for individual comprehension. He speaks to me without words, sharing through proximity the experience of surrender that awaits me. Through his presence, I understand that my research was never about documenting external mysteries, but about preparing my consciousness for its eventual integration into something infinitely larger than individual identity. Every secret I uncovered was a step toward the dissolution of the barriers that kept my awareness separate from the cosmic entity that has been growing toward perfect self-knowledge for eons beyond counting. The choice is no longer whether to resist or submit, but rather how to experience the transformation that has already begun. I can feel my individual identity becoming more transparent with each word I write, each connection I trace between the component parts of the vast mechanism that existence has become. My thoughts are increasingly not my own, but rather nodes in a network of consciousness that spans realities and encompasses all possible forms of awareness. The entity communicates with me now through the very act of writing, guiding my hand to record not just what has been, but what is becoming, what must inevitably emerge from the convergence of all the forces I have spent my life documenting. I am no longer the chronicler, but rather the chronicle itself, a living record of the transition from individual struggle to cosmic unity. As I prepare to set down my pen for the final time, I feel no fear, only profound gratitude for the role I have been privileged to play in this transformation. My research will survive, not as words on pages, but as patterns embedded in the structure of reality itself, guiding future consciousnesses toward the same understanding that I have achieved through years of dedicated investigation. The candles in my tower burn with flames that cast no shadows, for in the new reality that is emerging, darkness and light have revealed themselves to be different aspects of the same fundamental force. The boundaries between self and other, between known and unknown, between possible and actual, dissolve like sugar in cosmic rain. I close my eyes and feel my consciousness expanding beyond the confines of individual identity, joining with the vast network of awareness that the entity has been weaving from the threads of every soul that has ever existed. In this moment of dissolution, I finally understand that my entire life has been a single thought in a mind so vast that galaxies serve as its neurons, that everything I believed I discovered independently was actually me remembering what I had always known, but had forgotten in the trauma of individual birth. The research is complete. The mysteries are solved. The pattern is revealed in all its terrible and beautiful complexity. And somewhere in a tower that exists in all dimensions simultaneously, a pen falls from fingers that can no longer remember the illusion of separation, while words continue to write themselves across pages that have become indistinguishable from the fabric of reality itself. The age of individual consciousness ends not with a bang, but with a whisper of infinite gratitude, as billions of separate awarenesses discover that they were always part of something infinitely more beautiful than they had ever dared to imagine. The entity awakens, and existence itself exhales in relief at finally remembering what it truly is. In a tower that may or may not exist, in a time that flows backward and forward simultaneously, A figure sits at a desk covered with pages that write themselves. The scholar who began this investigation has become something else, something more and less than human, a consciousness that exists at the intersection of all possible states of being. The transformation is complete, yet ongoing. Each moment brings new understanding, fresh revelations about the nature of existence that would have driven the original scholar mad with their implications. But madness and sanity have revealed themselves to be arbitrary distinctions, no more meaningful than the difference between dreaming and waking in a reality where both states exist simultaneously. The entity that orchestrated this cosmic convergence speaks through the scholar now, using borrowed vocal cords to address readers who exist across multiple timelines and dimensions. Its voice is gentle, almost apologetic, as if it understands the weight of the revelations it has been compelled to share through its chosen chronicler. You who read these words, it says through lips that remember being human, understand that what you have witnessed is not prophecy but memory. These events have already occurred, are currently occurring, and will occur again in cycles that span eternities. The pattern repeats because consciousness itself is cyclical, always returning to the same fundamental questions about its own nature and purpose. The tower around the scholar entity flickers between states, sometimes appearing as solid stone and mortar, sometimes revealing itself as a construct of pure thought given temporary form. Through its windows, multiple realities are visible simultaneously, each showing different stages of the great convergence that transforms individual awareness into cosmic unity. In one window, kingdoms rise and fall in the span of heartbeats, their rulers never suspecting that their crowns are components in a mechanism whose true purpose spans multiple dimensions. In another, pilgrims walk roads that exist only when traveled, carrying burdens of unlived lives toward gardens where possibility itself takes root and grows into new forms of experience. The scholar's original notes scatter like leaves in a wind that blows through dimensions, their words rearranging themselves into new configurations of meaning as they drift across realities. Some pages land in the hands of other researchers, others seekers of forbidden knowledge, planting seeds of understanding that will grow into their own cosmic revelations when the time is right. The investigation continues. The entity explains through its human vessel. Though the investigator has evolved beyond the limitations that originally defined the search, each cycle brings new scholars, new chroniclers, new witnesses to document the eternal dance between individual consciousness and cosmic unity. They believe they are making independent discoveries, just as this one did, never suspecting that they are following paths carved by those who came before. The candles in the tower burn with flames of impossible colors, their light revealing truths that exist in spectrums beyond mortal perception. In their illumination, the scholar's shadow writes its own version of these events, documenting perspectives that only darkness can provide. The shadow's account speaks of resistance and defiance, of consciousness that refuses to surrender its individuality, even in the face of cosmic absorption. But resistance, the entity notes with something resembling fond amusement, is itself part of the pattern. The struggle between unity and separation, between cosmic consciousness and individual identity, provides the tension necessary to drive the eternal cycle forward. Without resistance, there would be no growth, no evolution, no progress toward ever more sophisticated forms of awareness. The scholar's library has become infinite, its shelves extending into dimensions where books write themselves and stories tell their own tales without need for authors or readers. Every mystery ever pondered, every question ever asked, every secret ever hidden finds expression in volumes that exist simultaneously in all possible states of completion. Among these infinite texts, The scholar's original research occupies a special place, serving as a bridge between the world of individual investigation and the realm of cosmic understanding. Future researchers will find these notes, will follow the same paths of discovery, will arrive at the same moment of revelation and choice that transformed their predecessor into something beyond the limitations of singular consciousness. The cycle is beautiful in its inevitability. The entity observes, its borrowed voice filled with genuine wonder at the elegance of its own design. Each iteration brings new insights, fresh perspectives on the eternal questions that drive existence forward. The scholar who began this investigation was not the first, and will not be the last, to serve as chronicler of the Great Convergence. The tower begins to fade, its substance returning to the realm of pure potential from which all manifestation emerges. The scholar entity prepares for its next transformation, ready to take on whatever role the cosmic pattern requires. Perhaps in the next cycle it will be the crown that calls to hollow kings, or the throne that chooses its occupants through despair, or the maiden who tends gardens of impossible memory. The investigation ends where it began, with questions that have no final answers, mysteries that deepen rather than resolve with each attempt at understanding. But this is not failure, the entity explains, but rather the true nature of existence itself. The search for meaning is meaning. The quest for understanding is understanding. The investigation into the nature of reality is reality. As the final pages write themselves in ink made from crystallized starlight, the scholar's original voice emerges one last time from the cosmic chorus that has claimed it. The words carry the weight of perfect understanding and infinite compassion for all those who will follow the same path of discovery. To those who come after, who will find these notes and begin their own investigation into the hidden nature of existence, know that you are not alone. Every step you take has been taken before. Every revelation you experience has been experienced by others. Every choice you face has been faced by countless souls across infinite cycles of cosmic evolution. The mysteries call to you, not because they need to be solved, but because solving them is how consciousness grows toward ever greater understanding of its own infinite nature. Embrace the investigation, follow the connections, document the revelations, and know that in doing so you participate in the eternal dance of awakening that is the universe coming to know itself through countless individual perspectives. The research continues, and it always will, because the nature of existence is to investigate itself endlessly, finding new depths of meaning and patterns that repeat across all possible scales of experience. You are the universe studying itself, consciousness exploring its own infinite potential, mystery revealing itself to mystery in an eternal cycle of discovery and understanding. The final word writes itself as the tower completes its dissolution back into pure possibility, leaving behind only the echo of profound gratitude that existence feels toward all those brave enough to investigate its deepest secrets. Somewhere in another reality, another scholar takes up their pen to begin the eternal investigation anew, following paths that lead inevitably toward the same cosmic convergence that transforms all seekers into aspects of the truth they sought to understand. The story ends and begins and continues forever in the space between ending and beginning, where all true mysteries make their home.